The fluorescent lights inside the elevator flickered as Claire Bennett pressed the button for the 22nd floor, her hands trembling so violently she nearly missed the cold metal panel. Behind her, footsteps echoed across the marble lobby of Meridian Tower, growing closer with each pounding beat inside her chest. She kept hitting the closed door, button breath shallow and disordered, as if every inhale might be the one that made her collapse. The brass doors slid shut, agonizingly slow, cruel in their hesitation. And just when the remaining gap was small enough to offer a shred of hope, a large hand thrust through, triggering the sensor and forcing the doors wide open. Claire froze. She no longer knew whether she was anchored in reality or trapped in a hallucination as the world tilted around her, and by pure instinct she reached out, grasping the nearest hand as though it were the only thing keeping her alive. But the moment her fingertips brushed warm skin, she knew she had made a mistake. The hand was strong, marked by faint scars across the knuckles, and adorned with a gold ring etched with an unfamiliar emblem. It was not the hand of the man hunting her. This was someone else entirely, a different danger carved in a form she did not recognize. Claire's gaze rose slowly. A dark charcoal suit fitted so precisely it could only have been tailored a white shirt, glowing softly beneath the elevator's flickering lights. And when her eyes met his, she went utterly still. His eyes were a deep, near-black-brown cold, and fathomless, cutting straight through her as if her soul were the first thing he saw. He was tall, carrying a Mediterranean presence, his dark hair swept back with deliberate intent, his features a sharp blend of classic beauty and unapologetic power. But it was his gaze that stole her breath, something knowing something sovereign, something she had no business provoking. "Chi ti sta seguendo?" His voice spilled out in Italian, low and smooth, like an aged wine sending a tremor through the enclosed space. Claire blinked, her hand still gripping his, her entire body shaking uncontrollably. I don't understand." His eyes softened, just barely small enough to miss if she weren't looking directly at him. When he spoke again in English, his voice still held the warm cadence of Italy, but now it was clear, steady, and unsettlingly gentle. "Who is following you?" The question sliced through her chest like a quiet blade. How could a stranger, one so impossibly composed, read her so easily? She had tried to hide, lived like a shadow, pretended to be ordinary. And yet here she was, trembling like a leaf in winter, clinging to the hand of a man she had never met, as if her life depended on him. The words lodged in her throat as the elevator began to rise, the illuminated numbers climbing. 3rd floor, 4th floor, 5th floor. Each number brought her closer to the place she feared most. Kramer was waiting for her. He always found her somehow. The man beside her shifted just slightly, and only then did she realize she was still gripping him hard enough for her nails to dig into his skin. Claire jerked her hand back, face burning with embarrassment, but he turned his palm and caught her hand again with a firmness that felt strangely gentle. "It's all right." His voice was quiet but definitive, carrying an odd steadiness that made something inside her calm for the first time in months. "Whatever this is, whoever is chasing you, you're safe now." She almost laughed. Safe. She hadn't known that feeling for 3 long months. Not since she discovered the irregular transactions, the falsified financial reports, the hidden ties between her company and powerful names tucked deep into the city's underbelly. Not since she sent the evidence out, believing justice would follow. He'll find me," she whispered, her voice barely rising above the hum of the machinery. "He always does." The man's expression darkened into something dangerous. "What is his name?" His tone was soft, but beneath the softness lay a quiet fury held on a tight leash. Claire shivered suddenly, unsure which man before her was the greater threat. If you're listening to this, and something inside you resonates, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, like and share this video so we can continue creating stories that touch the heart every day. And if you don't mind, Tell me, where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and let us know which corner of the world this story has reached. We cherish every word you share with us. Claire didn't know why she told this man about Marcus Kramer, about the fear that had followed her like a shadow that never slept. Maybe she was too exhausted to keep hiding. Maybe his eyes were too steady, too knowing amid the chaos. He never looked away from her, not with fear, not with disbelief, only with a focus so sharp it was as though he was reading each tremor of her body through instincts shaped by years surviving between the edges of law and darkness. 12th floor, 13th floor. The elevator rose in a steady glide, but Claire heard nothing except her own heartbeat and her labored breathing filling the cramped space. He still held her hand now, fully surrounding her cold fingers with a warmth and strength she hadn't expected. I'm Daniel Moretti. He spoke slowly, each word deliberate, as if telling her his name was a significant act. The name struck her like a faint electric shock along her spine. Moretti. A name whispered in unofficial reports and hushed office conversations, rumors about a man who controlled half the properties in Manhattan and made the other half afraid to say his name aloud. When she looked up again, Daniel had pressed the button for the 18th floor. Then, without a word, he hit the emergency stop. The elevator shuddered gently and went still between floors. No alarm, no jolt, only a silence so absolute it felt eerie. Claire gasped, but before she could speak, Daniel did. You don't have to go any farther if you don't want to. His voice remained soft, but carried the weight of stone. You have two choices, Claire Bennett. 1. You continue to the 22nd floor and walk into the trap waiting for you because I promise you, he has someone there. Or 2. You step out of this elevator with me. Right now. No promises, no obligations, just another path. Claire stared at him, her heart tightening painfully. How could she trust a stranger, no matter how steady his eyes, no matter how strong his hand, no matter how grounding his voice felt? But how could she walk into the 22nd floor, where her story might end? She had once believed the law would protect her, that truth carried weight, that journalists would speak up, that the authorities would investigate. But no one came. No one except Daniel Moretti, a man she never expected, never imagined. She bit her lip, looking down at his hand still holding hers. Part of her wanted to scream, to run, but another part, quieter, more fragile, but undeniable, wanted to collapse and trust that someone might be strong enough to catch her. He didn't rush her. He waited, watching her with an expression that promised he would honor whatever she chose, but his gaze made it impossible to walk alone. All right. Her voice was faint, barely more than breath. All right, I'll go with you. Daniel gave a single small nod, and in that moment his hand tightened around hers again, not because she was shaking now, but as an unspoken vow. Without another word, he restarted the elevator, and when the door slid open on the 18th floor, he stepped out first. He turned to her, his eyes free of doubt, filled only with a protective instinct so natural it sent a ripple through her chest. Claire hesitated for half a heartbeat before crossing the threshold between the place she was hunted and the path she could not foresee. But when her foot touched the cold gray carpet of the hallway, she knew she had already chosen. And this time, she would not turn back. The elevator doors closed behind them with a low metallic thud as Daniel moved swiftly down the corridor on the 18th floor, his eyes scanning every hidden camera and every shadowed corner. While Claire followed closely, her breathing still uneven, though her feet continued to move in hesitant steps across the thick carpet, every sense stretched tight, as if the smallest sound might signal someone drawing near. Daniel stopped before an unmarked door, pulling from his suit jacket a matte black keycard and sliding it across the sensor, the door opening almost silently to reveal a narrow passage leading to a service elevator. Claire blinked in surprise, but said nothing as he waited for her to enter first, then stepped in behind her and closed the door without offering any explanation, though everything he did had the practiced rhythm of someone who had done this countless times. When the second elevator opened, she realized they were in the basement of the building. The bright lights gone, replaced by a dim yellow glow reflecting off bare concrete where a black SUV waited with its engine still warm headlights off, and a tall man in a long coat stood beside it, his gaze sweeping over Claire before shifting to Daniel with a silent nod. "Vincent, get us out of here," Daniel said quickly, opening the back door for Claire, who climbed in with her heart still hammering against her ribs as Vincent settled into the driver's seat and eased the SUV through the concrete pillars and out into the evening traffic just as dusk settled over the city. Claire looked back at Meridian Tower, its 22nd floor windows still glowing, and imagined Kramer standing somewhere behind that glass, or one of his people phone in hand making the call she had feared for months. She tightened her grip on her coat and turned toward Daniel, whose expression remained unreadable, while his eyes never stopped sweeping the world beyond the window. A moment later, he lifted his phone, typing rapidly before bringing it to his ear, listening in complete stillness, and when he ended the call, he turned to Claire and said, "Two people showed up on the 22nd floor. A silver-haired man and a woman dressed like a receptionist, but not registered in the security system. There's no doubt they were waiting for you." Claire nodded faintly, though inside she felt a scream rising, having expected it, but feeling the truth strike harder when spoken aloud. Vincent turned onto the avenue and headed through Midtown, while Daniel continued reading encrypted messages flashing across his screen, and Claire felt her hands go cold as she realized she was in a car with two strangers leaving behind. The only familiar places she had left yet, for reasons she could not explain. She no longer felt the raw panic that had consumed her hours earlier. Something in Daniel's quiet confidence in the controlled silence surrounding him made her believe that at least tonight she would not die. As the SUV crossed the Queensboro Bridge, Manhattan, shrinking behind them like a closing chapter, Claire understood that everything was shifting, that from this moment forward, nothing would remain the same. And though she had no idea whether Daniel Moretti was a savior or simply another powerful force as dangerous as Kramer, she knew he had pulled her out of a trap. She whispered almost to herself, "Thank you." Daniel glanced over, his eyes sharp as a blade, though softened for a flicker of a moment as he said, "Don't thank me yet. We're not out of this." The SUV sped north along the highway, the city lights falling away like a ribbon of memories, fading into darkness. And Claire sat silently in the back seat, watching the world blur past the long shadows of trees, stretching beneath the streetlights, like fractured pieces of her own past racing backward, unsure where they were going and unwilling to ask, because she feared the answer, or feared what it would mean about the control she no longer held over her own life. Though strangely, she no longer felt the terror that had seized her in the elevator, or during the footsteps chasing her, feeling instead, a bone-deep exhaustion that dulled every reaction. Daniel sat in the front passenger seat, half turned toward her, the dim glow of the dashboard carving the angles of his face into something sculpted from stone, his expression unyielding while his eyes never drifted from her for long, as if waiting for the moment she would collapse or speak the truth he had not yet demanded. Claire finally spoke, her voice rough from hours of silence. "Where are we going, Hudson Valley?" Daniel replied simply, meeting her gaze in the rearview mirror. "I have a safe place there. No one but my own people know it exists. You'll have time to breathe and to decide what you want to do next." She pressed her lips together and nodded, before quietly adding, "I'm a financial analyst. I work for Riverton Development Group. On the surface, it's a real estate development firm, but I found irregular expenses, mismatched transactions, slush funds, shell companies. I dug deeper. That's when everything began to fall apart." Daniel didn't interrupt, and Claire continued as though speaking was the only way to keep herself from unraveling. "I sent reports to 3 major newspapers, an FBI office, and even an international nonprofit that investigates financial crimes. No one responded. Then my phone was tapped. My email inbox was wiped clean. My best friend Vanessa, a journalist, disappeared. No one knows where she went. A few days later, they started following me. I couldn't go home. I couldn't call anyone." Daniel leaned back slightly, his gaze never leaving hers. Do you still have copies of what you found? Claire nodded weakly, fingers tightening around her coat. I have a USB drive with one copy. And two more I mailed out. One never reached its destination. The other was returned to me. Daniel looked out the window for a moment as if calculating, then asked, "How is Kramer tied to all this?" Claire hesitated before answering. "He's a major investor, but never under his own name. He launders money through construction projects and uses his connections to bury audit reports. I only learned his name after tracing a company in Panama linked to a chain of transactions. I should never have known. I should have looked away." Daniel's mouth shifted slightly, not quite a smile, and not quite mockery, as he said, "No one should look away from something like that. But not everyone has the courage to confront it." Claire rested her head against the window, her eyes heavy. "I'm not courageous. I'm just scared enough to run." Daniel turned to Vincent and asked, "How much longer?" "About 45 minutes," Vincent replied steadily, hands firm on the wheel. Claire closed her eyes, though her mind refused to settle, spinning through everything she had said and everything she had lost. Feeling the emptiness inside her, only widen, unsure whether she had stepped onto a new path or deeper into another abyss. But knowing at least that tonight she was not alone, and perhaps in the smallest way, that alone felt like something resembling hope. As the SUV turned onto the narrow gravel road climbing the hillside, Claire straightened in her seat, eyes widening at the scene slowly emerging ahead. A Tuscan-style villa rising out of the muted darkness like a world apart, its red-tiled roof, tall stone archways, vine-covered balconies, and warm golden lights spilling from within, giving it an air of both serenity and quiet mystery, with no tall fences or electronic gates as she had imagined, and yet a subtle sense of being watched threaded through the air. When the car stopped beneath the stone-covered portico, Daniel stepped out first and opened her door, and Claire felt the weight of unseen eyes tracking them from hidden corners, though she saw no one. An older woman with silver hair tied neatly behind her head appeared as soon as they entered the foyer, her gaze gentle yet astute as she looked at Daniel and then at Claire, as though assessing everything in a single glance. "Welcome home, Daniel. And this is Claire Bennett," he replied simply. "She will stay here for a while. Rosa, give her a room." The woman nodded and turned to Claire. "Come with me." Her voice was low, neither cold nor warmly inviting. Claire followed quietly down a hallway into a spacious, simple, elegant room, with cream-colored walls, warm wooden floors, and windows overlooking a ridge of trees stretching toward distant hills. Rosa gestured toward the wardrobe. "Fresh clothes inside, bathroom in the corner. Ring the bell if you need anything. You should rest early." When the woman left, Claire sat on the edge of the bed with trembling hands, not from fear, but from the overwhelming sense that she had just stepped into a world entirely separate from the one she knew. Too quiet, too orderly, almost unreal. She opened her bag, retrieved the USB drive wrapped carefully in cloth, and hid it in the bottom drawer. When she lifted her head, her eyes landed on a photo frame beside the bed, a younger Daniel standing beside a smiling young woman with long hair. Both looked happy, and Daniel's eyes were brighter than the ones she had seen in the elevator. Claire set the frame down and lay back on the bed, gripping the blanket, and for the first time in weeks, she heard no footsteps behind her, no headlights trailing her through city streets, no midnight phone ringing, only silence wrapping around her like an invisible quilt. Yet something unsettled still whispered inside her. Who was Daniel Moretti really? Why did he have an estate guarded so discreetly, an invisible security presence, a housekeeper who obeyed him without hesitation? And more importantly, why was he helping her? No one in real estate, politics, or media she had ever met carried the same quiet gravity, the calm authority that surrounded him. She did not sleep immediately, staring at the ceiling as her mind churned with unanswered questions, until exhaustion finally tugged her eyelids closed, and she realized that perhaps for the first time in months, She would not dream of the hands choking her in the dark, or the silent screams she had lived with for so long, only the hush of a quiet room and the rustle of wind brushing past the window. Though doubt lingered, this place, however temporary, was the first where survival felt possible. When Claire awoke, the soft, pale light of dawn was already threading through the curtains, laying a gentle gold over the ceiling, and she did not know how long she had slept, only that, for the first time in months, she did not feel afraid. No nightmares, no phone calls, no sense of someone lurking outside her door. Everything was strangely still, almost suspiciously so. She dressed in the clean clothes prepared for her and stepped into the hallway where Rosa waited, leading her to the kitchen filled with the scent of coffee and warm pastries. Daniel sat at the table with an espresso in hand, eyes on the mist-covered courtyard, until he turned at the sound of her steps, nodding slightly. "Sleep well?" Claire nodded and took a seat opposite him, unsure whether to speak or wait, but Daniel did not leave her wondering long. He set his cup down, his gaze steady. "You wonder why I helped you?" Claire stiffened but nodded. "Yes. I don't understand. I'm not important. I'm not anyone to you. I have nothing you would need." Daniel was silent for a few seconds before interlacing his fingers. "I once had a younger sister. Her name was Alessia. She was 4 years younger than me, a lawyer working for a human rights organization. Smart, brave, with the strongest heart I have ever known." Claire felt her breath catch as his voice shifted, not quite pained, but distant. She uncovered a trafficking ring tied to a prominent politician. She planned to expose it, but before she could file her report, her car exploded in front of her house. They called it an accident. There was no investigation, no findings, no arrests. He paused, eyes drifting toward the sunlight piercing the trees outside. "That day I learned something. Justice is not built for the vulnerable, not when all they have is faith. After that, I built something else. A network, a way of working by my own rules. Not revenge entirely, but not forgiveness either." Claire's chest tightened as she listened, unsure if she had the right to speak. "When I saw you in the elevator, I recognized that look," he said, turning back to her, the steel in his eyes softened into something human. "The look of someone who knows too much and is barely holding on. I didn't save you because you're helpless. I saved you because you were at the point where if no one reached out, you wouldn't have had the strength to keep swimming." Claire drew a long breath, her hands tightening in her lap, and felt unexpected heat rise behind her eyes, because his words struck at something she had never allowed herself to admit, that she had reached her breaking point. She whispered, barely audible, "Thank you." Daniel shook his head. "Save that for when this is over. For now, tell me what you want to do. Keep running or fight." Claire looked at him for a long moment. Then, for the first time, her voice did not waver. "I want to end this. I want to make sure he can't hurt anyone again." Daniel nodded as though he had been waiting for that answer. "Then we begin." He led her down to a basement room hidden behind the library, a small command center she never expected to find, not filled with massive screens or glossy security systems, but everything neatly arranged, precise, undeniably used often. 4 people were already there. 3 men and 1 woman, each at a workstation or reviewing printed files, all of them looking up when Daniel entered. "This is my core team," Daniel said, his gaze sweeping across them. "They're not mercenaries. They're people the system failed, just like you, and they chose to stay and fight back." Claire nodded as her eyes moved across the room. The woman with short hair and glasses was Nadia, a data analyst and encryption specialist. The silver-haired man, Hal, had once been an investigative journalist until he lost his job for refusing to alter a story. Vincent, the driver, was also the head of security and logistics. The youngest, Matteo, was a hacker once imprisoned for breaching a bank linked to an arms trafficking ring. Standing at the center of the room, Daniel spoke clearly. "Claire brings a chain of data capable of toppling a laundering and political manipulation network, but the system is sealed tight. We cannot trust major media. We cannot hand this directly to government agencies. We do this our way. Nadia took the USB drive from Claire, plugged it into an isolated system, her eyes darting over lines of code as she typed rapidly before frowning slightly. This is raw data. Some compressed files, some encrypted, but they can be opened. If organized, classified, and rebuilt into a logical chain of evidence, this would force any court to pay attention. Claire stepped closer and pointed to a folder. This is the transaction chain between shell companies. Money circles through 3 countries before returning to the United States as legitimate investment. Nadia began mapping the network, the links blooming across the screen like an enormous web. Hal added, "If we release only raw data, the public won't understand. They need a story, a timeline, a clear narrative to show how the truth was buried." Daniel nodded and turned to Claire. "Can you reconstruct everything from the moment you noticed the first discrepancy?" Claire hesitated, but nodded. "I remember every detail. I lived inside it." For the next several hours, she worked alongside Nadia and Hal, cross-referencing the data with her memories, her entire body tensing whenever a familiar name appeared, as audio clips, images, email threads, and transaction logs formed a mosaic that finally made sense. Daniel never interrupted, always present, overseeing every move. At one point, he took a brief call in Italian, his voice low and ice-cold, and when he returned, he said, "Kramer is tightening surveillance around Manhattan. He knows something is wrong. We need to move faster." Matteo opened a secure channel, prepared to send an encoded signal once the data was ready. Hal began drafting the report like a full investigative exposé with evidence statements and visuals, and Claire read each line as if rereading her own life, realizing she was no longer just an analyst, but the first link in a chain that could fracture an entire power structure. As dusk settled, Daniel sat beside her, his voice softer. "I won't force you to stand at the front if you're not ready." Claire looked at him, her eyes tired but clearer than they had been in months. "I'm not running anymore. Not after everything we've done." Daniel held her gaze for a moment before nodding, a quiet flicker of acceptance in his eyes. "Then from here on, we do not step back." The next morning began with an unusual stillness, sunlight slipping softly through the villa's window slats, while Claire felt a thin layer of unease settling across her shoulders like a weight she could not explain. And in the open kitchen, Rosa poured her a cup of tea, although her eyes drifted toward the windows more often than usual. Claire sat at the table, barely touching the cup, before Daniel entered, his dark shirt crisp and his eyes sharp with vigilance, glancing toward Vincent, who stood near the doorway, checking his phone in silence. There was abnormal movement in the western woods. Vincent said a camera glitched for several seconds. At 2 in the morning, could be an animal, but he did not believe in coincidences. Daniel nodded and told Rosa to cut all external connections, no calls leaving the property unless routed through encrypted channels, and to shift the entire security team into rapid response mode. Claire set her cup down, trying to steady her voice as she asked if they already knew she was here, and Daniel held her gaze, his tone low but calm, saying he believed they were tracking a signal, not certain yet, but suspicious enough, and from that moment on, she was not to step outside the main house without someone accompanying her. Nadia emerged from the lower floor carrying a data board, reporting signs of an attempted network breach so precise it had not broken past Matteo's firewall, but clearly indicated someone was using proxy servers to trace them, and Claire felt a cold shiver wash through her, because this no longer felt like instinct but certainty. Someone, likely Kramer himself, was following every breadcrumb, perhaps through an old device, an email she had once opened, a forgotten weakness she no longer remembered. She turned to Daniel, and this time saw real concern flickering in his eyes, as she asked what would happen if Kramer found the villa, and whether Daniel would take her away, but instead he answered quietly, firmly, that if Kramer came, he would not take her anywhere, he would stay and finish this here, and before that man laid a hand on anyone in the house, he would have to step over Daniel first. For hours afterward, the villa tightened like a held breath, Matteo rechecking every camera feed and reinforcing encryption, Nadia shutting down communication channels and setting up false signal points. Hal contacting an independent journalist he trusted to prepare a contingency release, while Claire helped Rosa seal the windows and verify the locks, her hands trembling not only from fear, but from the knowledge that she was standing on the edge of a storm she was no longer sure she could survive. By nightfall, the silence inside the villa had become the loudest sound of all. No laughter, no casual conversation, only the quiet awareness that something was drawing near, and Claire sat on the stone steps behind the garden, watching the thin moonlight spill across the distant trees, until Daniel approached and draped a shawl over her shoulders. "You holding up?" he asked gently, and she nodded without looking away from the darkness, admitting she was unsure she was ready, but also knew she could no longer retreat. Daniel sat beside her, his shoulder brushing hers, as he said she did not need to be ready. She only needed to hold on to the truth, and he would handle the rest. And when she turned to him, their eyes met, in a moment small but steeped in quiet understanding, interrupted only by the faint rustle of something moving in the forest. Maybe wind, maybe footsteps, and neither of them turned away, because this time Claire knew she was no longer alone, and if the hunter had come, she had someone standing in front of her. The tension inside the villa did not lift as the night deepened, and after the security team finished the final perimeter sweep, everyone returned to their stations. Vincent to the monitoring room, Nadia to her network screens, Hal to the last paragraphs of his report, Matteo to the grid of false transmission points. Claire stepped inside the dim dining room where Daniel sat alone at the table with 2 untouched glasses of red wine, and when he saw her, he tilted his head in quiet invitation. She joined him, lifted the glass, and tasted the faint bitterness that warmed her chest, realizing she could not remember the last time she had sat down to a peaceful meal. Daniel leaned back, observing her, with a patience that felt deeper than usual, as though he were waiting for her to speak. But she was the one who broke the silence first, asking why he had helped her, and admitting she did not believe he was the type of man who rescued strangers from elevators and brought them into his home. Daniel smiled an unguarded smile she had never seen before and said she was right. He rarely did such things, but that night when she grabbed his hand, he saw the same look he had once seen in his younger sister Alessia, someone who did not cry for help with words, but with her eyes, and the desperate way she clung to any scrap of hope left. Claire stared at her glass, her fingers tight on the stem, as she confessed she had been so afraid she had not realized what she was doing, that she simply did not want to die alone. And Daniel nodded, his eyes softening as he told her he had been there, not by coincidence, but because he had stayed in the building after a scheduled meeting was delayed. The elevator had stopped longer than it should have, and when the doors opened, he saw her standing there. No one had reached his sister in time, and he refused to watch that happen again. Claire swallowed hard, emotion clogging her throat, whispering that she did not know how to thank him enough. But Daniel shook his head, saying she did not need to thank him, because she was standing up on her own feet, and he was only there to keep her from falling while she did it. Silence settled gently between them, lighter than the danger around them, and touched by something fragile, something human. And when Daniel told her she was not as weak as she believed, Claire met his eyes with a new steadiness. Telling him she once thought she was only a small office worker, a tiny gear in a vast machine. Yet she now understood that even the smallest gear could bring an entire machine to a halt if it chose to stop turning. Daniel's smile held quiet pride as he replied that a machine never fought back against its operator, but a person could. Claire leaned back with a long breath, knowing no attack might come tonight, but certain a storm was approaching, and Daniel refilled her glass, his voice soft as he promised she would not face it alone. And she looked directly into his eyes and said she believed him a simple truth that felt like her first real act of courage in a world built on deception. Morning sunlight spilled gently across the polished wooden floor of the villa's library as Claire sat before her laptop, her mind drifting to Daniel's words. "You will not be alone." Yet a rising unease settled in her chest. The air felt too calm, too expectant. Suddenly her phone vibrated. Not a call, but an encrypted message from an unknown ID. Claire opened it and the blood drained from her face. It was a photo. Grainy and taken in a dim basement, but unmistakable. Vanessa, her missing journalist friend, tied to a metal chair, her face bruised and eyes closed in exhaustion. Beneath the image was a message that sliced through Claire's heart. "We have her. Bring the drive to the old gas station at the Route 9 intersection. 15 minutes. Come alone. If we see a single one of Moretti's men, or if you tell him she dies before you get here, we are watching." Claire stared at the screen, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Instinct screamed at her to find Daniel, but terror paralyzed her logic. If they were watching the house, if she alerted the security team, Vanessa would pay the price. She had dragged her friend into this mess. She couldn't gamble with Vanessa's life now. With trembling hands, Claire scribbled a hasty note on the desk. "I'm sorry. I had to," and slipped the USB drive into her coat. She moved like a ghost, slipping out the side exit to her car, her breath shallow as she drove toward the station, checking her mirrors, and praying she wasn't being followed by Daniel's men, believing she was saving a life. But when she arrived at the desolate station, there was no Vanessa, only a black SUV parked in the shadows. A window rolled down and a man she didn't recognize smirked, holding up a phone with the same photo. "You're a loyal friend, Claire," he sneered. Before she could retreat, the back door flew open. A second man lunged out, seizing her arm and yanking her toward the car. A thick cloth with a chemical scent clamped over her mouth and nose. A scream tore from her throat before the drug cut it off her limbs, thrashing helplessly against their strength until her body went limp. They dragged her inside the door, slamming shut, as the SUV screeched away, leaving the station silent, as though nothing had happened. Back at the villa, Vincent was the first to notice the irregularity when Claire failed to appear in the dining room, and Rosa found the brief note on the table saying she would return in 1 hour. A cold weight settled in Daniel's spine as he called for Vincent to pull up the external cameras, and the screen showed Claire leaving through the main gate alone with no escort, while a traffic camera near Route 9 revealed a black SUV tailing her from the opposite direction. Daniel clenched his fist, saying it was no coincidence, but a trap, ordering a full lockdown of outgoing information and activating the hidden tracker he had embedded in Claire's car key on the first day she arrived, the screen flashing a final location in the outskirts of Peekskill, near the river, before the signal cut out. Daniel's hand tightened around his holster, his eyes narrowing into a blade. "Prepare the car. We leave immediately. And call in an extra team. Claire is in their hands now." Rage and fear surged together in his chest, not because she disobeyed, but because he had failed to tell her the truth. That beyond the files she carried, Claire herself was the crucial link, the only person capable of bringing down David Kramer's corrupt empire. And now she was gone. The black SUV sped along the deserted roads, skirting the Hudson River like a ghost, tearing through the night, leaving behind a fading trail and a hollow ache swelling in Daniel's chest. And when the final signal from Claire's car key disappeared from the screen, Vincent immediately forwarded the data to the digital operations team, while Daniel sat frozen for a few seconds, his eyes turning to ice, before he suddenly rose to his feet and signaled Vincent to prepare 2 vehicles and a 3-man team. Within less than 5 minutes, they had left the villa, diving into the darkness at dangerous speed as Vincent drove and read the satellite-linked tablet, pulling up traffic cameras, only to discover that the kidnapper's route had been planned with surgical precision to avoid every possible point of surveillance. Daniel breathed hard as he fought to keep his anger under control, though the fear inside him gnawed at his reason, because Claire was the only person he had ever allowed to step into the gray territory of his mind. And now she was somewhere out there alone, bound and held by men who knew nothing of mercy. When they reached Peekskill, the last signal pinpointed the old riverfront warehouses, and Daniel ordered the cars to stop while he scanned the area through an infrared scope, the ruined building coming into view with its rusted sheet metal roof and a flickering light from a second-floor window. Vincent lowered the window and released a small drone that rose into the air and swept over the site until a blurry image appeared. A figure bound to a chair in the darkness, head slumped forward, and Daniel's pulse hammered when he recognized the pale strands of Claire's hair. Without hesitation, he gave the order, splitting the team, so one group circled to the back while he and Vincent approached from the west, and at Daniel's silent countdown, the metal door burst open from his kick, the clanging echo jolting the three men inside, who spun around in shock, one reaching for a gun, but dropping it, as Vincent shot him cleanly in the shoulder, while the remaining two tried to flee, only to be intercepted at the back exit. Daniel drove forward weapon ready, but eyes fixed solely on Claire, who was still conscious, though her face had gone pale, and her lips had darkened from cold and fear. Yet something in her gaze remained unbroken, and when he cut the ropes she collapsed against him with a stuttering breath, whispering apologies about believing them to be the FBI, before he pulled her close and told her to stop speaking because she was safe, and none of this was her fault. She clung to his shirt as if letting go would send her plunging back into that suffocating darkness, and after the men were secured, Daniel ordered a swift retreat, refusing to believe that only 3 underlings had been sent, because this was undoubtedly only the first move. He placed Claire in the car and directed them along an alternate route, avoiding every predictable road, and on the way back she sat silently glancing at him now and then, as though needing to confirm he was truly there and not some fragile illusion. In the hush of the car she whispered with a trembling voice but with a resolve forged from terror and awakening that she no longer wanted to run, that she wanted to end this, and Daniel looked at her with something that was neither fury nor mere protectiveness, but recognition, telling her that next time they would strike first. The SUV merged onto a narrow southern road, leaving behind the death-stained warehouse and the distant rising wail of police sirens closing one chapter, even as Daniel sensed that the true battle had only begun. He stood later before the glass tower deep in Manhattan's Eastern Financial District, where David Kramer often met with powerful investors and political allies. And although Claire was not with him, she remained under strict protection at the villa. Her eyes before he left haunted him as a silent reminder that this confrontation was no longer about pride or influence, but about survival. Daniel passed the security gate without obstruction, as if someone had paved the way, and on the second floor inside a conference room with glass walls opening onto the skyline. Kramer waited in a tailored gray suit, with a practiced smile, masking arrogance, his 2 guards positioned behind him, with barely perceptible shifts of posture to signal that the territory still belonged to their employer. Daniel said nothing at first as he drew out a chair and sat opposite Kramer, laying his hands on the table and holding the man's gaze without blinking. Kramer spoke with a breathy ease, carrying a threat, saying he had not expected Daniel to appear in person, and assuming he would hide the girl forever. But Daniel tilted his head and told him he was wrong, that Claire no longer needed to hide, and the truth she carried would soon cease to be secret. Kramer gave a thin laugh and reminded him that the media would never believe a woman kidnapped twice and sheltered by a man like Daniel, claiming he had enough people to twist public perception, and that Daniel, despite being a Moretti, was nothing more than a wealthy man with a bloody past. Daniel did not deny it. Instead, he smiled with a coldness that made the room feel smaller, as he murmured that precisely because his past was soaked in violence, Kramer should know he was not the type to stop at threats. Silence followed for several seconds before Kramer leaned forward with a look of contempt and asked what Daniel wanted, and Daniel answered slowly that he wanted an exchange. Kramer would cease all interference and leave Claire unharmed, and Daniel, in return, would withhold releasing a recording. Kramer flinched for a fraction of a second before laughing, as if the idea were absurd, asking whether Daniel thought him foolish enough to believe he possessed anything of value, and Daniel simply set a small recorder on the table, pressed play, and let Kramer's own voice fill the room, instructing someone to make the girl disappear just like before and leave no trace. When the recording ended, Daniel informed him there were multiple copies stored in multiple places, advising him not to test his luck. Kramer's face darkened, the smile vanishing, replaced by a calculating stare before he softened his tone and asked how much Daniel wanted, prompting Daniel to answer that he had not come to negotiate price. Kramer rose, circling the room with the lazy confidence of a man who believed he owned the city, telling Daniel he resembled his father, equally stubborn and equally deluded to think justice could be bought by truth, And when he insisted that in New York, justice was defined by whoever paid more, Daniel stood and promised that this time, money would not save him. Kramer stepped back with an expression shifting from disdain to dawning awareness of danger warning. Daniel, he would regret this. And Daniel replied that he had regretted things before, but never sparing men like Kramer, then walked out without turning. Vincent met him just outside, and Daniel climbed into the car with a terrifying calm, telling Vincent to begin, and Vincent immediately set the planned chain of actions in motion. They avoided major news networks because Daniel knew Kramer's influence ran too deep. So instead, within 30 minutes, the recording of Kramer's own voice, along with security camera images, capturing his clandestine meetings with compromised officials, appeared on a small but fiercely trusted independent outlet, the City Pulse. And within an hour, the story spread across social media, hundreds of thousands sharing it, horrified not only by Kramer's chilling instructions, but by his casual approach to ordering Claire's death as if it were routine business. Headlines exploded with outrage forums, and local groups swarmed with calls for an immediate investigation, and people who had once stayed silent now stepped forward with stories of threats, coercion, and quiet disappearances tied to Kramer's empire. At the villa, Claire sat before her laptop, eyes wide as comment sections flooded with anger and support, and Daniel stood behind her with a calm that masked the quiet satisfaction rising inside him as she turned to him with trembling disbelief and asked how he had done it, and he told her softly that the key was not volume, but the right audience. The authorities did not respond instantly, but the weight of public pressure became too great to ignore. Within 24 hours, the mayor's office issued a statement calling for a special inquiry, the city police launched an investigative task force, and Kramer scrambled to hold a press conference where he denied everything and claimed the recording was doctored, though his pale face and evasive answers only fueled suspicion. On a live local broadcast, a former employee from his corporation called in recounting shadowy contracts and enormous sums that vanished without trace. And Daniel knew the media, when wielded correctly, was a blade sharp enough to take down men who had survived by controlling information, and this time that blade had turned against its master. Claire could no longer sit still. She organized her documents, highlighted key evidence, and sent them to independent investigators and anti-corruption groups, reclaiming piece by piece the justice Kramer had stolen. And amid the rising public storm came a message she never expected, a letter from a mother who had lost her child in a so-called traffic accident, now revealed to be connected to Kramer's network, and Claire broke down in tears, not from fear, but because for the first time her voice truly mattered. Daniel placed a steady hand on her shoulder and murmured that she was only just getting started, and she nodded through a trembling smile as the realization settled that the city was finally watching, and nothing from this point forward could ever go back to what it once was. The late afternoon light spilled over the garden behind the villa, gilding every branch, every stone step, every moss-covered wall in a soft amber glow, as Claire sat on an iron bench with a cup of cold tea in hand, watching birds drift lazily across the Hudson Valley sky. Her heart still carrying the echo of a long day, filled with news calls and hundreds of messages from strangers, offering thanks, encouragement, and solidarity. Yet beneath all of it, she thought most about the man who had sat beside her through every step of this journey, asking for nothing, binding her to nothing, simply offering his steady presence like a landmark in the center of a storm. Daniel walked out from the house, sleeves rolled up, exhaustion lining his face after too many sleepless nights. Though his eyes remained clear, holding that same quiet composure he never seemed to lose. And he carried 2 glasses of wine, handed her one, and sat beside her without a word, while the wind whispered through the leaves and their breaths fell into an easy rhythm, until Claire spoke in a low, inward tone, confessing that before everything happened, she had thought herself strong, only to discover that the hardest part was not running or fighting, but allowing someone to come close and remain. And Daniel turned to her in silence, while she met his eyes without fear or doubt. For the first time in weeks, admitting that the reason she trusted him was not his strength or his ability to protect her, but the simple truth that in that first moment, when she grabbed the wrong hand, he had not pulled away. Daniel smiled softly, surprised and warmed, telling her that she had been the first person to need him, without wanting anything from him. No demand, no negotiation, only a hand to hold. And Claire set her glass down and faced him, fully touching his cheek, with a tenderness free of pretense, as she whispered that she no longer sought only safety, but also the certainty that regardless of how everything ended, the man she trusted would be the one she chose to begin again with. And in that moment, the distance between them vanished, as Daniel leaned in and placed a gentle kiss on her forehead, just enough to quiet every lingering fear and stir to life a feeling she thought she had lost forever, telling her softly that this was the first time he had ever felt peace while holding someone's hand. And Claire smiled and rested against him as twilight settled around them, two people stepping out of the storm and into something deeper, imperfect, but built on trust, and trust was all they needed. Meanwhile, the media erupted, public outrage swelled, and authorities were forced to respond. Though Daniel understood men like David Kramer too well to believe he would sit quietly and accept his downfall, and indeed the first counterstrike came early the next morning, when Claire received a message from a reporter warning her of a series of sensational tabloid articles accusing her of fabricating evidence to extort Kramer after being fired for dishonesty, dredging up old photos, screenshots, even misusing images of her missing friend to imply a personal vendetta. Her name splashed across headlines as a manipulator, while her face was framed by cruel phrases portraying her as a dangerous schemer, and her hands shook not from fear, but from a raw, deep anger as she marched to the library where Daniel was on a call and slammed her phone onto the table, telling him the attack had begun. And Daniel quickly read the articles with an expressionless calm, though his voice deepened as he recognized the tactic of discrediting the whistleblower. A tired but still effective trick if left unanswered. Claire's voice trembled with frustration at the thought that some people would believe the lies that she had fought so long to avoid being dragged into the public eye, only to be defamed overnight. And Daniel placed a steady hand on her shoulder, assuring her they would not allow Kramer to regain control, that she had come too far to be undone by trash journalism, then ordered Vincent to prepare the video containing the most damning evidence of all, the recording of Kramer himself ordering a kill. An hour later, that footage paired with surveillance images from an abandoned parking lot where Kramer met two loyal enforcers appeared on a respected legal affairs outlet, and Kramer's unmistakable voice declared that the girl must not survive the week, and that Moretti could be eliminated as well, if necessary. A revelation that struck like thunder and forced mainstream networks to cover it, while human rights groups and independent attorneys demanded an expanded investigation, prompting the sheriff's office to summon Kramer for questioning that same night. Claire watched the broadcast replay the video repeatedly, each time accompanied by commentary from analysts and attorneys, and Daniel stood behind her quietly before taking her hand in a silent vow that even though the shadowy games of power were far from over, the truth had begun to prevail, and Claire met his gaze with new resolve. By the next morning, the official manhunt had begun, as evidence flooded the airwaves and social media, and Kramer's allies fell into sudden silence or scrambled to distance themselves, while the city sheriff and federal agents issued a warrant for his arrest on charges of corruption, attempted murder, money laundering, and political manipulation, and within 24 hours, the city's legal system trembled as Kramer's private jet was grounded, his assets frozen, his offices raided, and he himself was captured in his Long Island mansion while preparing to flee, the image of his disheveled suit and handcuffs plastered across the front pages. Claire watched the news beside Daniel without the shock. She once felt her emotions replaced by a quiet release, as though she were watching a ghost leave her life, telling Daniel that Kramer had never imagined she could undo him, because he had assumed she would stay silent and afraid, like so many women he had crushed before. And Daniel answered that she had transformed the trembling hand in the elevator into the very one that delivered the decisive blow. Names connected to Kramer's network were exposed. Executives summoned, politicians forced to resign. And the same media that once smeared her now praised her courage, calling her a survivor who brought down a hidden empire, with interview invitations, book offers, and requests for collaboration pouring in from major networks and advocacy groups, all of which she declined because she wanted not fame, but the simple right to live in peace. That evening, Daniel walked with her along the gravel path behind the garden. As the sun slipped behind the hills and the scent of fallen leaves drifted in the air, and Claire whispered that perhaps it was over, to which Daniel replied softly that this was only the beginning, and she took his hand not for safety, but by choice. Lights glowed in the house behind them, Rosa's laughter drifting from the kitchen, and Claire felt the weight inside her lift as she realized the nightmare was finally behind her, that she was no longer a victim, but a survivor, and more than that, a victor. A month later, Hudson Valley entered autumn with hills of blazing red maples, and the villa nestled peacefully among them, becoming a refuge for the woman who had once run from the world. And Claire rose early each morning to brew coffee and sit on the porch, writing the story of her journey, not for praise, but to remind herself that she had not broken, filling page after page with the memories of fear and narrow escapes and small victories, while Daniel traveled to the city for meetings and returned every Thursday night, and she would greet him at the door with a simple touch that affirmed they were walking forward together. Rosa remained the heart of the house, leaving cookies on Claire's desk, with handwritten notes, and dinners shared among the three of them grew into rituals Claire cherished as she learned to laugh again, to cook simple meals, to plant lavender along the fence, after Vincent remarked that she was making the place feel like a home. Some nights old memories still startled her from sleep, but each time Daniel's hand at her back grounded her, reminding her that her past no longer owned her, and the presence he offered was never loud or controlling, simply steady and unwavering. By the end of the month, Claire finished her first manuscript, not intended for publication, but as an act of healing, reclaiming her voice after years of silence and fear. And when Daniel found the neatly bound stack of pages, he asked if she was done, and she smiled, saying she believed she had said everything she needed to say, and he told her gently that he believed she had only written the first chapter. When the last leaves fell on the porch, Claire sat by the window, watching the mist rise over the distant forest, no longer carrying fear in her eyes, but something rooted and calm, knowing that life would still bring dark days, but that she now had a foundation, and for the first time in years, she felt truly alive, not merely surviving or hiding, but living in every true sense of the word. On a quiet weekend morning, when the sky was still draped in the last thin veil of mist from the night before, and the first rays of sunlight slipped through the leaves, Daniel led Claire out of the villa, telling her to dress warmly because the air would be colder at higher ground. She did not ask questions, simply pulled on the thick sweater he had set out for her, and followed him into the familiar black SUV. They drove along winding roads that hugged the hillsides, through a forest of blazing late-season maples, where each falling leaf seemed to drift as slowly as time itself. Daniel drove with one hand, the other wrapped around hers, saying nothing and needing to say nothing. After almost an hour, they turned onto a gravel path leading to a wide-open clearing atop a hill where the entire Hudson Valley stretched before them like a colossal painting, with vast fields, clusters of small rooftops in the distance, and layers of violet mountains along the horizon. The wind carried the scent of wild grass and resin. Claire stepped out of the car, her eyes widening as she took it all in. Before her was a plot of fenced land, simple wooden stakes marking the foundation, and a set of architectural drawings clipped to a temporary board. She turned to Daniel with eyes full of unspoken questions. He walked closer, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, and pointed toward a distant line of trees, saying that would be the living room, with a large window facing the sunset, the way she once said she loved the late afternoon light. Claire nodded softly, lips parted but unable to form words. He continued pointing in another direction, saying the kitchen would be there with the dining table near the window so Rosa could look out at the vegetable garden while she cooked. Then he paused, looked deeply into Claire's eyes, and told her that right there at the heart of the house was their new beginning. Claire stood frozen, her heart pounding like the echo of her own footsteps from the days when she used to run, but this time she no longer fled. Daniel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small key attached to a metal tag engraved with the word hope. He placed it in her hand, saying it was the key to the very first door they would open together. Claire looked down at the key, and then back at Daniel, her eyes filled with a warmth and clarity she once believed she would never feel again. She asked him if he was certain, her voice roughened by emotion, and he answered that he was more certain of this than of anything else in his life, that from the moment he first saw her in the elevator, with her trembling hand and terrified eyes, he knew she needed help. But after everything she had survived, he also understood that he needed her too, not because she was fragile, but because she was brave, resilient, and real. She stepped closer, leaned her head against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath the thick knit of his sweater. And as the wind tousled her hair, he whispered that this time they would build their life on truth, not fear. Claire tightened her grip around the key, as though holding on to a promise. On the horizon, the sun grew brighter, piercing through layers of clouds, as if the world itself were witnessing the opening of a new chapter. There was no more running, no more darkness, only the two of them. A stretch of open land, a blueprint, and a future waiting to be built from the love, trust, and courage they had fought so hard to protect. Claire whispered that she once believed she had lost everything, only to discover she had just found the most important thing of all, and Daniel held her hand tighter, his eyes fixed on the horizon, as he promised he would never let her lose it again. That same morning, when Claire stepped out onto the porch of her home, sunlight poured like warm honey over the grass, still damp with dew, and she saw Daniel waiting beside his pickup truck, wearing a rolled-sleeve shirt and dark jeans, looking so disarmingly simple that he seemed almost like a stranger compared to the powerful man in a tailored suit whose hand she had once grasped by mistake in that trembling elevator. Daniel waved her over his eyes, carrying the quiet excitement of a boy hiding a gift. She approached with curiosity, and he opened the passenger door, telling her to come with him for a while. Claire climbed in without asking anything. They drove under tree-shaded streets where sunlight flickered through the branches like frames from an old memory, until they stopped in front of an old building in a small neighborhood, once an abandoned library, but now restored its wooden doors, freshly painted glass panes replaced, and a polished sign reading "The Haven Where Stories Are Heard." Claire turned to him in disbelief, asking what it was. Daniel smiled, took her hand gently, and led her inside to a space filled with towering bookshelves, rough wooden tables, soft brown armchairs, and pools of warm golden light. On one wall hung framed pages marked with passages she had once written. In the center of the room sat a small meeting table holding printed copies of her finished manuscript and a contract from an independent publisher. Daniel told her he had contacted them not to thrust her into the public eye, but to ensure her story would have a place to live, and that if she was willing, this space could become a haven for people who had once stood where she once stood. Claire froze in place, lips trembling, her hands shaking not from fear, but from emotion. She looked at Daniel, her heart swelling with an overwhelming tide she could barely control. He stepped closer and held her hands firmly, and the touch brought her back to the first moment their hands had met in the elevator, amid flickering lights, the sound of her pounding heartbeat, and footsteps closing in. Then she had reached for a stranger's hand to survive. Now she offered her hand to the man she chose to walk beside. Gone was the panic. Only trust remained. Daniel asked softly, as though he could read her thoughts, whether she regretted grabbing the wrong hand that day. Claire looked at him for a long, quiet moment, then smiled in a way that held no shadows from her past, tightened her grip on his hand, and told him no, because in the end, She had reached for the right person. Outside the window, golden leaves drifted in the wind, as if the world itself nodded in agreement, with a promise spoken not in words, but in the heart, and among a room filled with stories that had once been silenced. They stood hand in hand, ready to write the next chapter, this time, their own. That afternoon, Claire sat on a wooden chair outside the new house, rising slowly from the ground, every brick holding a chapter of her life, while the orange glow of sunset washed over the Hudson Valley, in warmth and peace. She heard Daniel's familiar footsteps approaching slow and steady, and felt a hand rest gently on her shoulder, bringing a calm that steadied her heartbeat. Claire lifted her gaze to Daniel, the man who had pulled her back from the edge of panic, and from the ruins of her faith in herself and the world. She smiled softly, her eyes no longer trembling like they had in that flickering elevator, but filled instead with peace and gratitude. She murmured that for the first time in many months, she no longer checked the locks on the doors, and Daniel smiled sitting down beside her, while looking toward the distant lights of homes beginning to glow as night descended. He squeezed her shoulder gently, telling her she no longer needed to, because now she had a place to stay, not just a house, but a home. In that moment, Claire realized that safety did not come from walls or reinforced doors, but from a heart no longer terrified of tomorrow, from the ability to fall asleep without a knife under her pillow, from the quiet presence of someone sitting beside her, steady and unwavering, whose single touch could scatter the darkest shadows. Her journey from a hunted woman living in fear to someone who dared to stand up to trust and finally to find peace was proof that no matter how deep the darkness, hope remained for those who did not abandon themselves. This story is not only about danger and pursuit, but also a reminder that a hand reached at the right moment can save a life, and a single act of courage can lead to an entirely new future. My friend, how do you feel as you reach the end of this journey? Have you ever faced a moment when everything seemed to collapse and you had to choose in the midst of the rubble? Have you ever wished for someone to reach out just when you needed it most? Please share your thoughts in the comments so we can hear the story from your own heart. Your words may not only connect us, but may also be what someone out there needs to rise from their own long night. And if this story touched you, do not forget to subscribe to our channel, like the video, and share it with the people you care for. Every share spreads a little more hope, offering this small story a chance to warm another soul. We will continue bringing heartfelt, gripping, and deeply human stories every day. Thank you for staying with us until this final moment. We wish you and your family good health, joy, and peace in every corner of your life. Goodbye, and we will see you in the next video.